Good morning. Welcome to our continuing series on the topic of freedom. And today we're going to be completing the discussion of the 10 plagues. Are you ready for the 10 plagues? Not for us, God forbid. Just a little bit of a rehash of the first 5 plagues. But first, the premise that the 10 plagues were not just intended as punishment for the Egyptians. They were not just the way that God forced Pharaoh to let the people go, although it did serve those functions. But the main purpose of the 10 plagues then and today is education. And another way of looking at the 10 plagues is to look at it as a 10-step therapy. A therapy to be free, to enjoy authentic freedom. And in order to experience true freedom, the first 2 plagues are 2 steps in destroying our idols, the things that we worship that are unholy and unworthy of being worshipped. Getting away from the things that control us irrationally. And we first have to recognize intellectually that the idol is not God, and we have no reason to serve it and worship it. And the second step, the frogs, was to get us detached emotionally. You know, a person who's a drug addict first has to know how terrible drugs are. He has to recognize it intellectually, but that's not enough. He also has to recognize it emotionally. He has to feel, this is terrible, this is disgusting. And you're on the road, the initial stages for experiencing freedom. You got rid of the things that control you, at least in your mind and your heart. They're no longer controlling you. It's not enough, because you could always go back. It's easy to revert to your old ways, but it's the first steps that have to be taken. The third plague of lice, which the sorcerers couldn't replicate because it was too small, that has a very powerful message when it comes to freedom. And I didn't mention this last week, but I'll mention it now. I did mention that Judaism focuses on the little things. God is not concerned with how big things are. Small things could have more value than big things. But there's another very important lesson on the road to freedom. Many people take baby steps, and they think to themselves, of what benefit would these baby steps be? I'm not going to change. And you take small strides, baby steps, in a very negative way. It's not really going to change me. It's not going to help me. So why should I even bother? People are deterred when they see how small things are. And this plague, in the process of experiencing freedom, teaches us that the small things have tremendous value. And if you're going in the right direction, never put down a small change. Those small changes, number one, will lead you to big changes in the aggregate. But number two, the small changes in and of themselves have value. God does not look at us and expects us to become perfect overnight. He expects us to keep on growing, obviously. He wants us to be more and better. But the small gestures in and of themselves have intrinsic value. The fourth plague, or the plague of the mixture of the wild animals, which frightened the Egyptians. But another important part of that plague was that it was the first plague in which the Torah mentions the fact that this plague did not affect the Israelites. It only affected the Egyptians, which demonstrates that God had a special relationship with the Jewish people. That this is what the Egyptians had to know then. And we have to know it today also, that God has a special relationship with us. But it goes deeper than that. When a person has to change, they have to start believing in themselves. If they don't believe that they have any value, they're not going to be able to change. They will never experience true freedom. So this plague, among other lessons that it provides us with, is the idea that we do have a special relationship. Every one of us has a special relationship with God, and we are special. As someone once put it, God doesn't create garbage. He doesn't create junk. The fact that you are here means that you have value. As a great Hasidic master once said, that your birthday is the day in which God says that I can't have a world without you. You are indispensable for the world. If you wouldn't be needed, you wouldn't have been created. You're only created because you are important. And that's extremely important in the process of trying to experience true freedom. You have to have the knowledge of your uniqueness. The fifth plague, which was the plague of pestilence, where the animals died, where the plagues were beginning to affect their economy, but also has a very powerful lesson. Here too, the Torah makes a point of saying that the animals of the Israelites were not affected. There was a division between the two kinds of animals. And what that tells us is that what makes us unique, up until this point, we're unique because we have a godly soul. It's the godly soul in us that makes us unique. We have a special spark of divinity in us. But what about our animal soul? We always look at the animal soul as our enemy. The animal soul gets in the way of our godly soul. And this plague tells us there are two kinds of animal souls. The animal souls, let's say the animal soul's penchant for anger, for hostility, that's a negative animal soul. But what about an animal soul? It looks for pleasure. Is that negative? Yeah, it could be negative. It depends what your pleasure is all about. But you could seek pleasure in Torah, in studying Torah. You could seek pleasure in doing a mitzvah. You could seek pleasure in helping another person. That's also your animal soul. That's your selfish soul. But your selfish soul could also recognize that doing good is a very satisfying and enjoyable activity. So here we have a division between the two kinds of animals. If you want to be free, you have to get your animal soul involved as well. You can't just rely that your godly soul is going to do everything for you, because number one, your godly soul is going to be covered up with your animal soul. It's not going to allow your godly soul to express itself. Number two, you're not just a godly soul, you also have an animal soul, and the challenge is to get your animal soul to go in the right direction. And when you have both your godly soul and your animal soul cooperating, you're on the road to experiencing true freedom. Now we're ready for the next 5 plagues, or the spiritual lessons that we could learn from them. What is plague number 6? Boils. This is the first plague that actually affected their bodies directly. The blood, the water turning into blood, the frogs, the lice, the mixture of wild animals, the pestilence. So far, if it affected anyone's body, there was only secondarily. It was not the goal of the plague. Here, the bodies were becoming disfigured. And here's where God says, now we're going to start to get serious. Until now, we were preparing you for the transformation. It says about this plague that Moses, all of the people in Pharaoh's court couldn't stand before Moses. What does that mean? When you use that term in terms of our mindset, it means we were completely discombobulated. Our whole image was distorted. We were disfigured because you have to have a total paradigm change. You have to change your whole outlook on life. You can't continue to the goal of freedom using the same old paradigms. You have to change your paradigms, and that's not easy. That's why you have 5 plagues before this, to soften you, to make it possible that you should be receptive to it. But a person has to recognize that their whole paradigm has to change, because we have been indoctrinated from the time we're little children by faulty influences. The idols that we just spoke about before, that we have to get rid of our idols, the idols have become us. We think in idolatrous ways. I don't mean idolatrous, ancient idolatry where you bow down to a silver statue. I mean idolatry, things that we worship as being the highest ideals. And I'm going to go out on a limb to mention one of them that many people might disagree with, the university. The university is considered to be, that's the highest thing you can reach if you are in a university, and especially if you can be a professor in a university. I would venture to say, and I hope they don't quote me in this one sentence, that university professors, the elite intellectuals, are the lowest level of humanity.
They can be, Yes, I know some of them.
We all know some of them. And I can say it because I was a professor in the university for 26 years, 36 years rather. So obviously I'm not generalizing that everyone is like that, but the intellectual institution of university is such a corrupt institution. I always say there are two professions that always claim that they are objective. And those are the professors and the journalists. And they are the most opinionated people who are the least objective of anyone. When I used to teach a class in the university, I would tell our students, I'm not objective. I have my views and very strong views. I'm going to try to present things as fairly as I can, but don't think I'm objective. I'm not objective. But would you ever hear a professor telling that to his class? No, of course not, because as long as you agree with him, he's objective. But that's one of the idols, and that has become, and that's not the only idol in society, but there are so many idols that we worship that have become part of us. So just to know that the idol is not an idol, is not God, is not enough. You have to change your whole paradigm. Give you a hypothetical. If someone comes to you, an angel comes to you and says, you're going to have a child. Your child, you have a choice. The child could be simple, but sincere, and kind and good, but very simple, and will never get a job in a sophisticated area of society. Or your child can be the greatest scientist in the world, but will be a good-for-nothing egotist, and I'm not going to add any more negative words, but you get the drift. Which would you choose?
The first.
Okay, if you answered it quickly, you're in good shape. If you had to think for a few seconds, you need a paradigm shift, because obviously your sophistication doesn't mean a thing to God unless it's attached to spiritual and ethical and moral decency and sophistication. And if you're just a simple person and you do the right things with sincerity, you are light years ahead of that sophisticated professor or intellectual, whichever position they occupy. So you have to destroy, you have to disfigure. That's the plague of boils, where they were completely disfigured and they couldn't stand. Their whole approach to life had to change. But you want to change a person drastically, you can't just start off by beating them. You have to start off with a positive approach. I can't just go to a student in university and tell them, you're doing horrible things, and your professors are horrible, and your whole way of looking at life is horrible. You have to do it with a positive approach. In general, Judaism makes it obligatory for everyone to see if someone is doing something wrong, to rebuke them, to tell them they can't do what they're doing. But you have to do it, Maimonides says, you have to do it with love, you have to do it with calmness, you have to do it in a peaceful way. If that doesn't work, then you can resort to more powerful methods. But initially you have to work with people and treat them with respect and dignity in a positive way, and only then could you attack them if need be, and you won't even need it. There's an expression of the Talmud: a person should always use their left hand, the weaker hand, to push people away, and their right hand, or their stronger hand, to draw people close. which means that if you have to change a person, and you're in the position of a parent, a teacher, someone who's in charge of other people, you have to use your weaker forces to use for judgment, and the stronger forces you have to use to bring them close. And the Talmud gives an example of a rabbi who didn't do that. I'm not going to go into the details, and that wreaked havoc on the world for millennia, because the rabbi used both hands to push someone away. You're never supposed to use both hands, but if you have to use one hand, it should be the weaker hand. And the question has been asked, why does it mention the left hand first? And when I say left, by the way, it means the weaker hand. If you're left-handed, then your right hand is everyone else's right hand. Your left hand is everyone else's, the same as everyone else's right hand. So why does it start off with the left? If the precedent should be given to kindness and love, it should say you should use your right hand with kindness and your left hand for rebuking and reprimanding. So the Rebbe once explained that before you even start to talk to someone, it has to start off with love. Your first approach has to be love before you use methods. When the Talmud is talking about left and right, it's talking about the methodology. The methodology has to be the weaker hand for rebuking and the right hand for showing love and bringing them close. Yes? Then you're considered right-handed. But the idea is the weaker. It's a metaphor that use your weaker forces. Don't put as much energy in knocking someone down as you do in bringing them close and showing them love and affection. If you have to get bent out of shape in a positive way than in a negative way, even though sometimes you have to use force. Yes?
I don't know if this is true, but I've always heard that if somebody wanted to convert to Judaism, that they would be pushed away, which is the opposite of what you're saying.
Good question. The point over there is you're not pushing them away by rebuking them. You don't do it in a nasty way. You do it in a nice way, but you tell them that this is not for you. You're better off remaining where you are right now, because if you become part of the Jewish people, you're going to be subjected to all the things that Jewish people are subjected to. Why do you need it? And if the person says, you know what, you're right, I'll stay with the way I am, you did them a favor. You're not pushing them away in a negative way. You're pushing them away in a positive way. But before you even start with techniques, your attitude has to be positive. So obviously the first thing that you have to do is, let me put it this way, if you're a parent and you use your weaker hand to reprimand the child and to shout at the child, but in a weaker way, in a subdued way, and that's how you begin with the child, that's not going to work. The child has to know, and this is true not only about a biological child, it's true about a student, it's true about anyone, the person has to know that you love them. Before you even get into the issue of educating them, they have to know that you love them. Once they know you love them, then the next step is you tell them what they did was wrong. You can't cover it up. A child does something terrible, you can't just say, go and kiss and embrace the child. That's not going to work. The child will think he's getting praise and affection because of what he did wrong. But the child knows that you love him or her. Then that has to be followed by the hug and the embrace. And this is the plague where the Torah itself says they couldn't stand. They couldn't stand in presence of Moses. They were falling apart. Their whole paradigm was falling apart. And that's crucial in the process of getting to the point of experiencing true freedom. Your paradigm has to be disrupted. It has to be done in a sensitive way, of course. It starts off in a sensitive way, but then it has to be followed by a real realignment of your whole way of thinking. Then we get to the next plague of hail. what was unique about this plague was that fire and water coexisted. The hail had fire in it. Normally, fire and water can't dwell in one place. It was a miracle within a miracle, and this had the greatest impact. Why is that? Because it says in the Torah that those who feared God brought their animals and themselves inside, and they were not harmed. What does that mean in terms of the metaphor? In terms of the metaphor, there's the inside and there's the outside. The outside is a place that is filled with all sorts of influences. You go to a university, you're subjecting your child to a plethora, an abundance of negative influences. Yes, there are some positive things going on there as well. It's not all negative. But the child, the student, is now part of a whole mishmash of negative and crazy ideas. And as time goes on, they're becoming crazier and crazier, and you can't talk to the students. They're just so brainwashed. And this brainwashing, indoctrination doesn't begin at university level, it begins at kindergarten level, where teachers impart certain ideas to the students, to the children, and they become ingrained in them. So that's what we mean by the outside. The outside in Talmudic language is called Reshut Harabim, the public domain, a domain where there's no unity, there's no unifying ideology. Everything is broken into so many different, and most of which are negative influences. So what happened over here in this plague, the Egyptians, some of them, went inside. They were no longer, they recognized the outside is not a safe place to be. Now you could be in university and you can still be inside if you're protected, if you're insulated. So you can go to university, be part of a university experience, but if you have the right approach, you can insulate yourself so that you're impervious to all the negative influences there. But it's not easy. It's getting harder and harder. And that's why, before a parent sends his kid to university, it's not only important they should find out which university has less of this anti-Semitic atmosphere, which is pervasive now. They should also think about all the other negative influences that are not anti-Semitic, but they're anti-Jewish in their philosophy. So here, you had people coming inside. Not all the Egyptians, of course, but it was already having an impact that a person has to recognize that what's outside is not necessarily kosher and not necessarily healthy for you. Now, here this plague had, as I said before, fire in water, in the ice. A miracle. But it also has a lesson for us, where two kinds of, I mentioned this when we talked about the first two plagues, but it comes up here again, that you have the threats to our existence that come from ice and the threats to our existence that come from fire. Because a human being has certain areas in life in which their connection to it is one that's full of passion. Everyone is passionate about something. Very few people have passion for nothing. You have passion for something, and you're cold about other things. It's just a question of balance, how much passion you have and how much coldness and indifference you have. But it's not only important to have both passion and indifference, you have to have the passion for the right thing and the indifference for the right thing. And usually it's the other way around. People's passion are usually for negative things, and their indifference are to positive things. One of the worst things that happened to young people in this country, insofar as Judaism is concerned, and I can vouch for it being on campus for 20 years, from the 1970s, is that you had students that were passionate about everything except for Judaism, and there were students who were indifferent to Judaism, and the goal was to get the ones who were passionate about other things to be passionate about Judaism, and the ones who were indifferent to Judaism to get them to become passionate and not to be passionate about other things. And what I discovered Which of these two is worse, when you're passionate about the wrong thing or indifferent to the right things? Which do you think is worse? Okay, that's what I saw from my experience, that the students that were passionate about the wrong things were the ones who became the most attracted to Judaism when they were exposed to Judaism, they hadn't been before, because unfortunately most Jewish education in this country, the Hebrew schools, were miserable failures. Children, I know this from all the hundreds, maybe thousands by now, of young people who grew up who said that what turned them off to Judaism, there are some exceptions, what turned them off to Judaism was their Jewish education. And they became passionate about everything else except for Judaism, and some became indifferent and did not show any passion. The ones who showed passion against Judaism were the best candidates to become attracted to Judaism. The ones who were indifferent, that was a much greater challenge. Not to say that they didn't change. So here you have these two different threats to contend with: the threat of passion for the wrong thing and indifference for the right thing. Yeah.
Religion obviously is something of passion. If you don't have passion, you can't have really religion. And on the filling, you've got the 3 arms and the 4 arms. Do the 4 arms indicate more passion than the 3 arms? The shin. The 3-arm shin and the 4-arm shin. On the filling, does the 4-arm indicate more passion?
The 4-arm represents how the third intellectual level, das, is split into 2, which are the 2 primary emotions. So in that sense, you're right, that the 4-pronged shin is referring to in the tefillin that we wear on the head. There's a letter shin, which is the initial of God's name. And on one side, the shin has 3 arms, 3 whatever you call it, and the other side is 4. And the reason why 3 and 4 is that there are 3 intellectual levels, which we won't go into right now, but the third intellectual level produces the 2 primary emotions of love and fear, kindness and judgment. So with the second shin, you could say correctly, relates more to emotions than the first one. You're right. So what is the goal of this plague? The goal of this plague is to take from the outside and bring it inside. Look for an oasis. And that's what Judaism has created and given us. Where is the oasis? So throughout Jewish history, the oasis was your home. That's where you were secure from all the negative influences going on outside. A child grew up in a Jewish home. They were imbued with Jewish values, with Jewish warmth and Jewish dedication, for better or for worse. I mean, some took it all the way, some didn't take it, but at least they had something to go back to. There's so many people who came to America and lost their Judaism, but somehow they had memories from their home of how Judaism was observed in their home, the warmth, the love, and that brought them back. Now young people don't have that. The home has turned into, you brought the public domain into the home, especially with the internet and all the modern ways of accessing information. So we no longer have that oasis. So the only oasis we have left is the synagogue or the house of study, like the Jewish Discovery Center, paid advertisement. But that's the lesson. You have to go from the outside inside. You have to have an oasis. You can't always be inside. You can't survive if you're always inside. You have to go to work. You have to be part of the outside world. But you always have to have a place to go back to where you're in a private domain. And that's the plague of hail, where everyone is now changing gradually and able to experience the inside as opposed to the outside. The next plague of locusts. Unfortunately, going inside is still insufficient for freedom. Because if a paradigm shift is superimposed on you, but your natural state is to be in a different mode, in a different paradigm, it's always easy to relapse. Yes, you come home to the oasis, whatever the oasis is, and then you go back into the cruel world, into the public domain, and it gets you again, because that's what you grew up with. So even a person who becomes attracted to Judaism and changes their whole life and lives that way for 30 years, they could always relapse, because whatever you absorb in your youth, that defines you. So even if you change and you have a paradigm shift, it's always easy to go back. You always have to be on guard. The Talmud says a person should never trust in himself until the day that he dies. You're never secure, totally secure. You can get closer and closer to that, but you're never guaranteed. So just because you went inside and you have this oasis doesn't mean that you're already experiencing true freedom. So what is the next plague, the plague of locusts? The way the Torah describes it, that it covered the eye of the land. Now literally that means the locusts were so pervasive that you couldn't see the land. But there's a deeper way of looking at it, that the land meaning the earthly, lowly approach to life, the paradigm that we want to get away from, was completely covered up. That perspective was completely obliterated. And we were no longer, and when you're in this state of the plague of locusts, you're no longer vulnerable the way you were before, because the perspective of the land, of the earth, has been covered up. And the way to do this is to start to look at things from a different perspective. There are two ways of looking at everything. You could look at everything from the bottom up, and you can look at things from the top down. When you look at things from the bottom up, you're always closer to the bottom, because gravity always pulls you back down again. But when you look at things from the top down, when you look at things from, put it in more spiritual terms, from God's perspective, you see things in a totally different way. And what happened with this plague? It caused a famine. Obviously, if the locusts eat up all the land, all the crops, there's famine. And famine is a positive thing in a spiritual sense. The prophet refers to that we're no longer going to be hungry for food. We're going to be hungry for God's words. We're going to be hungry for knowledge. Your whole perspective changes. And you see things from a higher perspective. And that's the difference between prayer and Torah study. Judaism focuses on both. You can't just be a person praying all day, and you can't just be a person who studies Torah all day. You need prayer and Torah. What's the difference? Prayer is where you're situated on the ground. You're the way you are. You're not trying to present yourself as being holy. That's why the Jewish law requires that the cantor, the one who leads services, is not on the bima. It says clearly, halachically, the chazan is not supposed to be on the bima. He's supposed to be on the ground, because the whole idea of prayer is that you're coming from the depths and crying out to God. Prayer is compared to a ladder, in Jacob's dream, where the angels are going up and down. Why are they going up first? Angels come from the heavens. So there are simple explanations, but the deeper explanation is that the whole idea of prayer, which the ladder is a metaphor for, according to the Zohar, is to take your lowliness, the way you are, and to rise higher. But there's always a problem, because gravity will always send you back down again. You can't just rely on prayer. That's why we have Torah. Torah is the opposite. Torah is God's wisdom, and Torah is like water coming from on high, coming down. And so when you study Torah, that changes your perspective. Prayer doesn't change your perspective. It refines you, it elevates you. But Torah changes your whole perspective and takes everything from the top down. So that's the plague of locusts, where we go beyond just going from the outside inside, because you go back outside again, but you also have this approach that takes everything that you see from a different perspective, from the perspective of Torah. If a person is in a valley and they want to see what's going on there, they can see, but they can't see things in such detail and depth the way a person who's on the mountain looks down and sees the valley. When we study Torah, that changes our way of thinking. The Talmud says that Torah has the power to even affect a person's biological systems. Torah is the blueprint of creation, and therefore Torah has the power to alter nature. It has the power to alter our own nature. So the more you study Torah, the more your way of thinking changes. Then we get to the plague of darkness. This is an enigmatic plague, and the commentators are a little bit puzzled by this plague, because if you look at the 9 plagues and 8 plagues until now, there's a progression. They get more and more serious. First, the water turns into blood, but they were able to get water if they dug new wells. Frogs are disgusting, but they didn't kill anybody. Lice are even more disgusting. The animals start dying. The mixture of wild animals frightened people, but it didn't kill anybody necessarily. The animals died. The boils it's painful. It's getting worse now. The economy was now damaged, and now the boils. And then we have the locusts, which create a famine, which is the worst until now, because who knows how many thousands, if not millions, of people would perish in a famine. And now we have darkness. So for a week, they couldn't see. And there was no internet. That's what it is. For a full week, the teenagers didn't have internet. That's the worst plague. But seriously, why is that the 9th plague? That would have been one of the first plagues to frighten people. So Rashi gives 2 explanations. He says one explanation is a very sad one, that there were many Jews. According to one version, the majority of Jews didn't want to leave Egypt. When you are a slave for hundreds of years, that is the home that you know, and you don't want to change. So they all perished in the plague of darkness. But in order to make it possible for them to die without the Egyptians knowing about it, because if they knew about it, they'd say, yeah, we're dying, but they're also dying. They buried them in the plague of darkness. That's one explanation. Another explanation is that God told Moses to tell the people that they should ask the Egyptians for their wealth. And the people, when they were asked by their neighbors, we're leaving Egypt now, could you lend us or give us your gold, your silver, your clothing? The people said, we don't have any of that. And the Jew would say, no, during the plague of darkness, we rummaged through your home, and we know where you keep all your valuables, so don't lie to us. So what is the deeper meaning of these 2 reasons? One reason is burying the Egyptian mindset. This is what the plague of darkness accomplishes, that their whole Egyptian mindset is now being buried. The Jews who didn't want to leave Egypt, why? Because they were controlled by their Egyptian mindset, and they couldn't get rid of it. They were not ready for freedom. Unfortunately, society then was such that the people in Egypt were so much a part of the slavery mentality that they couldn't leave. And we see this in society today. You have prisoners. Most prisoners are not going to be rehabilitated by going to prison. You agree with that, Roy? Okay. The recidivism rate is I don't know, it's 90% or something like that. Going out of prison, many prisoners actually say they would like to go back to prison. Okay, that's a small minority, but the mentality is something that's so hard to get rid of, and that's what's true with the Jews in Egypt. So that mentality has to be buried. That's the plague of darkness. It's the plague that buried their mentality. But also, there's 2 types of negativity that we have to bury. There's conscious negativity, and that is much easier to deal with. And there's subconscious negativity that you're not even aware of that you possess. The famous story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the greatest person alive, one of the greatest Jewish leaders of all times. On his deathbed, he cried, and his students asked him, why are you crying? He says, I don't know where I'm going. And the question is asked, was he a fool? Did he delude himself? I mean, he was a man who devoted every minute of his life to studying Torah, teaching Torah, and saving people. He never had a moment to deal with himself. He was so righteous. So he was concerned more than anyone else that he may not go to paradise, he may go to the other place. And the Rebbe once explained, it's precisely because he was so busy doing good, he never had time to introspect, to find out what was going on beneath the surface, subconsciously. Judaism always knew about the subconscious. It wasn't Freud who invented the idea that we have a conscious and we have a subconscious. And he said, while consciously I'm a do-gooder, I did everything great, I'm not complaining about that, but I don't know who I really am. Maybe deep down, if I was given the time to be by myself, I would discover some very ugly things about my personality. And therefore that has to be expunged. It has to be refined. And that's why Jews believe in Gehenna, which is the Jewish version of hell, not as a punishment, but as a cleansing process. So he said, I don't know if I may need cleansing because I never had time to deal with my subconscious. So you have to bury the subconscious evil. And the Rebbe once said that before Mashiach, there's a prophecy in the book of Daniel that everything becomes exposed, everything becomes clear and refined. And I think we're seeing that happening in society today. We see who our friends are and who our enemies are. Things that you would never imagine happening on college campuses, calling for the genocide of Jews. You couldn't even, the Nazis didn't even do that. The Nazis didn't publicize what their plan was. They planned behind the scenes, but to publicize it, and here it's not just terrorists doing this, but it's students. Now, most of them don't know what they're talking about. They don't even know what intifada means. They don't know what the river and the sea is. They are totally ignorant. But there are some who are not totally ignorant, and they really mean it. Yes, we're going to get rid of all the Jews. And for this to be spoken publicly, and for presidents of universities to let it happen, they are the epitome of evil, these presidents of the university. I have so little respect, whatever little respect I had for the university, it reached the bottom. And you should really think before your children or grandchildren go to any university. I'd rather that Jews are not winning all the Nobel Prizes, but to be safe and to remain Jewish than to win these Nobel Prizes and have all this negativity going on. So the first thing we have to bury, so everything comes out into the open before Mashiach comes, and that's what the 9th plague foretells, that near the end of the process, things will come out, the negativity, the hidden negativity will come out, and we'll have to bury it. But at the same time, there is also hidden treasures. When your subconscious comes out, there are also hidden treasures that come out. The Rebbe made an interesting observation. He said that we're finding that people who you thought of as being very great, good people have some very bad traits that have come out. That's the subconscious coming out. Good people, you would normally think, and you're very wondering, these people are decent people. How could they do such horrible things? Because it's the time when the subconscious is exposing itself. And then you see the opposite. You're seeing people who you thought of are ordinary people, nothing special about them, and they become heroes. Do heroic things. Why? Because the subconscious is coming out. Well, that's what happens at the end of the plague of darkness. The negative subconscious was exposed and had to be buried, and the treasures were now being revealed. The positive subconscious is being revealed. And then we get to the ultimate plague, the plague of the, yes?
Before, on the 9th plague, from a psychological point of view, and I think this is from the Rabbi, but in order to get rid of hate, you need to, when people come out, it's natural to hate your oppressors. And by going in and asking and getting ready to get their jewelry, they're being given something by their oppressors, and they can follow through on the Bible commandment of love the stranger.
More than that, it says, don't despise an Egyptian because you were residents in his country.
Right.
That there's a special commandment not to direct your hostility towards the Egyptians, even though they didn't treat us nicely, to put it mildly.
Right, but they're told to get the jewelry in part to get something. And the other thing is, in regard to the jewelry, God made Abraham a promise when he foretold to Abraham about the slavery, and he said, you will come out with riches. And then, and if the Jews didn't get the riches, like it would be like Abraham had a claim against him that he didn't follow through on what he promised to Abraham.
Right. That's the reason why God says to Moses, please, he implored Moses to get them to take the wealth of Egypt, because he promised Abraham that his descendants will be slaves, but they'll come out with great wealth. And Abraham is going to tell God, God, you kept your first promise. Indeed, they were slaves, but the second promise you didn't keep. That's very true. That's the Talmud says that. So now we get to the last plague, the plague of the firstborn. It was obviously the worst plague, but the metaphor for it is there are different faculties that we possess, and we have the elite powers we possess. That's what the firstborn is a metaphor for. And at this point, we are ready to reach full self-actualization. We're at the point where we're able to reveal the deepest powers of our souls and to be able to accomplish things that we could never have imagined accomplishing. Because once you go through all these stages, all these therapies, you are ready to fully express the deepest aspects of who you are. And what is the deepest aspect of a human being? What is the thing on top of everything? In a certain sense, it's ego. The firstborn is a metaphor for one's ego. Ego we always look at as a terrible thing. No, ego is the most positive part of the person. It's the part of the person, if it's done the right way, that recognizes its unique status in this world, that we have a divine soul, that we are spiritual, that we are holy, that we are divine, that we are godly. And when you recognize that, you are the most humble person, because you realize that everything about you is not yours, it's all God's. A person who says, I'm a nobody, besides the fact that that's not humility. I think I shared the story once. There was once a Hasidic rabbi who was talking to his disciples, and one of the disciples was saying, oh, I'm so horrible, I'm so lowly, and the rabbi says to him, why are you such an egotist? Why are you talking so much about yourself? You're not worse than anyone, you're not better than anyone, you're just like everyone. Being humble doesn't mean you put yourself down. That's not the definition of humility. The definition of humility is you recognize that everything you have is a treasure that God gives you, and because of that you have special responsibilities to use that treasure for others. And the more you recognize that, the more humble you truly are. The more that you don't take credit for it yourself. Moses was the most humble person on the face of the earth, the Torah says. And the question is, he knew how special he was because he himself wrote the words dictated by God. But Moses is the greatest prophet that ever lived, and he's the most humble person that ever lived. How could he be humble when he knew that he was the greatest person around? And the answer is, well, at least one answer is, that he knew that he had these qualities, but he said, these are not my qualities, these are all God-given. If God had given them to some other person who's a nobody, that person would have been even better than me. It sounds like the two beggars who were talking about wealth. One said, if I was Rothschild, I'd be richer than Rothschild. So the other one says, how could you be richer than Rothschild? He says, because I would beg on the side. So Moses said, yes, I have all these qualities. I'm Rothschild. I'm a spiritual Rothschild. But if my gifts were given to some other person, no matter who that person is, that person would have been even better. They would have their own additions in addition to what they were given. Yes?
Question. What do you think? 80% Jewish who stay in Egypt, do they realize what they are in slavery or not?
Slavery was life.
Or,
That was their life.
so when we live regular life, in this, we know this rule in this life, we accept, maybe less accept, but it's our life. And somebody ask, guys, we need to change it and have to change our life. Maybe will be better. And I don't know will be better or not. And if I have regular life and everybody live in this life,
Okay, you're giving a good rationale why people didn't want to go out of Egypt, because,
for this reason,
right, that's true.
people don't want to live.
People are reluctant to go from something that they're familiar with to something they're not familiar with. Any change that disrupts your life is frightening to people. It's stressful. And some people would rather stay where they are. Look, I saw this in neighborhoods in Brooklyn. There were neighborhoods that turned very dangerous, and there were senior citizens who did not want to leave, even though they couldn't leave their apartments because they'd be mugged and be who knows what. It took a lot of effort to get them out. I know my own grandparents lived in a neighborhood that turned very dangerous. My grandfather would walk through bullets, being shot from one side of the street to another, and he had to be pulled out. He was reluctant to leave. So that's very true. No one is blaming these people and saying that they were evil. They were not evil people. They were just such products of slavery, they couldn't imagine getting out to a new way of living. And we have to be concerned with that it shouldn't affect us, that we shouldn't be that way. Many of us don't want to change. Why would I want to change? I'm comfortable with the way I am.
I was in Soviet Union. Every people live like me. No, somebody better, somebody a little bit worse. But in general, nobody, we didn't have enough food, we didn't have enough dress, but life is life, we know this, it's after Second War, we are poor, but we have great future. We will have communism and something like war, or socialism, what people would like to have now. Yes, but it was regular life. One my friend who lived Soviet Union before me, I was very busy in all music production and everything. My life was interesting enough. But he came to America, and 3 years after that he write me a letter, and in this letter I read words. Max, you are a very happy man. You cannot imagine how big shit is your life. Because he looked from here. But I had regular life. Of course I
Okay, the point is well taken. Any other questions? So the ultimate plague is the one where we're able to reveal the elite powers of who we are, and that's the freedom. And when we talk about Mashiach, what are we asking for? We're asking for an end to suffering, an end to the wars, an end to hatred, an end to strife. That's all true. But we're asking for much more. We're asking for us to be able to experience who we really are and be able to reveal our most elite powers. And they should not be covered up anymore. As long as any part of us is covered up, especially if it's the elite part of us, we're in exile, even if we have everything else taken care of.